Welcome to the second half of the Romanticism lecture. In this part, we're going to talk about the historical events that inform this movement. One of the biggest events is the Enclosure Acts. Enclosures start in the 1600s, but they go throughout the 1600s and the 1700s, and they really take off in the 18th century, kind of like right before Romanticism gets going. And what this did was this allowed landowners to combine land, gain more land, and enclose land in villages. So notice this part here where Parliament passes a law where 3/4 of the landowners could enclose the land. And it helps if you look at a picture. So before enclosure, like let's say you're the farmer that owns the little black pieces of land here. You might have had land all over the village. Like here's the village square, here's the church, here's the mill, and here's the common. The common is land that is owned by everyone, that everyone can use. Let's say you're not a farmer, you're the miller, but you have a cow and you could graze that cow on the common. Or your father is a weaver, but you are a peasant, you're a little kid, you're like 10 years old, and you have a flock of geese that you let forage on the common, and that geese is how you contribute to your family, by selling the feathers and selling off a goose now and then and selling eggs and stuff like that. So before the enclosures, we have strips of land just all over the place. After the enclosures, like let's say you were the farmer with the little black pieces of land, you were consolidated all your land, and now you have like a big area. And notice what happened to the commons. The land that used to be held for everybody and that everybody had access to now has been sold to private individuals. And think about what this would do for people. So we'll think about what the impact of the Enclosure Acts. There were very positive effects. There's a reason they went to this system. Less land was wasted. You could use machinery on larger plots of land. You could experiment with crop rotation. You were a lot less likely to have animal diseases, and less labor was needed to tend crops and animals because you weren't moving all over the place. You had more compact farms. It was just more efficient. There were also some negative effects you can imagine. If you couldn't prove the title to your land, you would lose it, and other landowners could buy it. So your family may have farmed that land for hundreds of years, and you might have lost it. If you didn't own land, but you had animals on common pasture, you couldn't do that anymore, and you would lose that income. Poor farmers are now unable to compete with big farmers. This should also sound really familiar to anybody whose family grew up in farming in America today. What's happening to small farms? How easy is it to compete with big agriculture, right? And factory farming and things like that. It's really hard, and the big groups will just buy up the little pieces of land. Well, where did all these poor people go when they lost their common land or lost the little strips of land that their family had had for hundreds of years? People go to the cities to find work, and they had to accept lower wages and poor conditions. So there were a lot of negative effects for poor people from the Enclosure Acts. Also happening in the 18th century, you absolutely don't write any of this down. But I want you to see how all of these inventions from the 18th century, inventions that are specific to the textile industry, help create the Industrial Revolution. We go from people producing fabric in their home, like a weaver weaving the thread into cloth, to factories that can weave the thread into cloth faster and more efficiently. In part because there are new forms of power. Things run on steam, things run by water, things, we have gas street lighting that will change the way people can operate in the city. So the Industrial Revolution happens at the same time so Britain is moving from an agricultural economy to an industrial economy, and we have all of these people who are getting pushed off the land, who are ready to become factory workers. And what happens? We get migration from the country to the city. In 1750, 10% of Britons lived in a city. 1851, 50%. That is a huge difference. And all of these things, when you hear the Romantic poets talk about nature, think about how this is affecting people's connection with nature. Think about how they talk when we see them, how they talk about the city and what the city is like as well. Also during this is a time of great political upheaval. From the French Revolution to Napoleon, and then Britain is involved in incredibly stressful, highly intense Napoleonic wars on and off for over 10 years. These are the key dates that you need to know for the Napoleonic Wars. But this was an incredibly stressful time that Britain was always worried about invasion. The British Army is mobilized, the British Navy, there are lots of battles. So this is a time of real political upheaval. During this time, because the threat of Napoleon is so great, England sometimes suspends the rights of habeas corpus, the free press, free speech, petition, assembly, all kinds of things. Things that, remember when I said Romantics support liberty? They had real problems with all of these suspension of domestic rights. During the Romantic period, we have a specific period called the Regency period. This is a political cartoon depicting the Prince Regent. Not very admirably either. He is shown smoking a cigar. He was really fat. He was a symbol of excess. For about 10 years, the regent, he's referred to as Prinny, because George III, the king during the American Revolution, is insane. So his son, who is his heir, functions as the king. King George III finally dies, and Prinny becomes George IV. He dies 10 years later, and his younger brother is crowned, and then that guy is going to die, and his niece is going to become Victoria. So this is what you need to know about the monarchy at this time. But what you also need to know is that a lot of people were very critical of the regent because he went into a lot of debt, he gambled a lot, he spent a lot of money on things. People were very critical of his personal habits. This is also a time when there are questions about religious freedom. The Test and Corporation Acts prevented people who were not members of the Church of England. So you could be a Protestant and not be a member of the Church of England if you were a Baptist, a Methodist, or a Unitarian. They were usually just referred to as a blanket term called dissenters. You could not run for Parliament. Also, you could not do that if you were Catholic. But at the end of the Romantic era, after the Napoleonic Wars, we get more religious freedom for people. Catholics are allowed to sit in Parliament. Non-Anglican Protestants are also allowed to sit in Parliament. But for a lot of the Romantic era, we will not have religious freedom for a number of people in England. So that's something to think about. Also, we have this awareness that there are two nations, the rich and the poor. The Luddites, that might be a word that's somewhat familiar to you, were protesting the Industrial Revolution, essentially, and the way that factories, how people today are all worried about robots taking their jobs. Well, the Luddites would go into the factories and break the machines. This is called frame breaking. And it's made a capital crime. They executed people for this. because it was seen as damaging the British economy and therefore the war effort. But they were worried about the machines, the factories taking their jobs. So that's how they reacted. Also, at this time, right at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, they passed really high tariffs on imported grain. And think about the consequences of this. This is great if you are a British landowner that owns land that produces wheat. But if you are not a wheat producer, it is not great for you. It raises the price of bread. Um, it makes that high. If you are a poor person, your bread got more expensive. Also, in 1824, finally, trade unions are legalized. They were illegal from 1799 to 1824, basically because they were really worried about groups of poor people getting together for political activity. However, once they're legal in 1824, we get a bunch of strikes. The powerful people don't like that, so in 1825 we have another Combination Act which allows trade unions but prevents them from bargaining collectively or striking, which are kind of their two most powerful tools in their arsenal. So we have a real restriction on the ability of working class people to politically mobilize. And working class people could not vote at this time. You had to have a certain amount of property worth a certain amount of money to vote in the 19th century. In 1832, we will get the Reform Bill. This gives the franchise, it gives the vote to middle class people, middle class men, I should say. They had to own property worth 10 pounds. So it does increase the political representation of some men. Up to now 1 out of every 5 men can vote. And this was seen as a huge advance at the time, but I want you to note it does nothing for the working class. Okay, you might remember at the very first Romantic lecture, I had this little quotation from William Blake, Auguries of Innocence. I have this end picture of Jim Morrison and this song. I want you to thinking about like the Romantics' support for political causes and liberty and freedom and their love of nature. It's no accident that a lot of people in the 60s in American culture like loved the Romantics, specifically Jim Morrison and the Doors. And if you listen very closely, I'm going to play a very short clip from a song called The End of the Night. You will hear Auguries of Innocence folded into their song. Take the highway to the end of the night, end of the night, end of the night. Make a journey to the bright midnight, end of the night, end of the night. Realms of bliss, realms of light. Summer until sweet delight. Summer until sweet